In the run-up to the Great War, the United States faced numerous resource shortages, dramatic inflation, and civil unrest. As the state of affairs began to deteriorate as the war dragged on and strict rationing was implemented, citizens would begin to riot and escalate into violence. By January 2077, the federal government began deploying frontline divisions equipped with power armor to quell domestic unrest. Desertions began as veterans from both the China and Alaska fronts found themselves fighting fellow Americans. The White House belittled those protesting, claiming that the president was suffering too, having to substitute cube steak for prime rib, while relying on the detestable Chateau Montreux's 2043 wine. The protesters were ignored, and those who took to the streets were labeled communists. The combination of these factors only further exacerbated the problems. In one incident in Roxbury, Boston, 4 were killed and 8 others were injured when a hungry crowd stormed a food bank, and soldiers guarding the depot opened fire into the unarmed crowd. What made the situation particularly noticeable was the fact that the soldiers were allegedly picking out targets in the crowd in advance, and laughing as they did so. This riot was part of an ongoing series of riots to plague the city of Boston. The riot began after soldiers of the United States Army's 184th Infantry Regiment opened fire on a group of unarmed civilians after an unknown person smashed the plate glass window of the Roxbury food bank, prompting several people in the line outside to storm into the establishment. Jonathan Corman, spokesperson for the Army, insisted the troops acted within their authority, stating that they issued several explicit verbal warnings not to break the line and attack the food bank, and that hunger is no excuse for civil disobedience, vandalism, or starting a riot that puts the lives in the area at risk. He emphasized that it was a difficult time, and taking the time to note specifically that the soldiers of the 184th Infantry Regiment had not had a food ration in 2 days, and understood their hunger, probably better than anyone. This, however, is contradicted by the civilian witnesses to the riot. 85-year-old grandmother Hannah Henry was in the line at the food bank and claims the soldiers had anything but order and liberty on their minds. The food crisis was an opportunity that Vault-Tec attempted to create a solution to, erecting facilities such as the Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center to test automation of the agricultural sector, worsening an already tense relationship between human job growth and robotic automation, and turning Vault 22 into a research center for creating experimental fertilizer and genetically modifying plant organisms. Food shortages weren't the only thing causing violent unrest in the country. In places like Appalachia, disenfranchised workers who were being squeezed by legislation like the Wartime Workers Act had begun to strike back at the giant conglomerates they feel had wronged them, feeling that between increasing robotic automation and the government's enabling of these egregious laws, violence was their last chance. The Wartime Workers Act was focused on maximizing production during wartime. Provisions for the act included requiring time-and-a-half pay for employees working shifts longer than 10 hours, but only for the 11th and 12th hours. The effective work week would also be lengthened to 6 days a week. The act also allowed for those suspected of communist leanings or other obstructions to work output to be charged with treason, a capital offense, and to be executed by hanging. Grafton Steel, a government-preferred war contractor, complied with the act. With an internal memo, the employees of Grafton Steel would be informed that they would be working 6 12-hour shifts a week. They would only receive time-and-a-half pay for the last 2 hours of their 12-hour shifts, a single 30-minute lunch break, and no longer get paid sick leave. As early as 2161, the region was rife with homelessness, with workers in the region struggling to make ends meet or provide for their families. The shifts away from traditional labor was accelerated by robot production, such as those created by Robco. These advanced robotic lines were designed to replace human workers in jobs deemed too dangerous. The former workforce of Appalachia saw these robots as the reason for their misery, having replaced miners, construction workers, policemen, and soldiers. In addition to robots built to replace humans, other variants were built to serve as a deterrent for striking, named the Strikebreaker Protectrons. The wave of automation culminated in Ballot Measure 6, slated for a vote in November 2077, the contents of which called for a standoff between local workers and the conglomerates such as Hornwright Industrial and Atomic Mining Services. The measure would issue a $2.6 billion bond to begin the process of replacing all human workers in the Appalachian government with automated systems, with the goal of complete automation by 2087. Among the opponents of the measure was Senator Sam Blackwell, advocating against what he described as a slow-moving disaster that would be devastating to constituents in the region. The unrest peaked when AMS forced families out of the town of Welch in October 2077. The initial resistance was against the AMS's corporate agents sent to evict the families of Welch, which had the element of surprise on the side of the workers and citizens, allowing them to easily gain the upper hand. The disenfranchised workers of Appalachia organized themselves quickly, setting up roadblocks and shutting down roads and factories across the western reaches of West Virginia, coordinating their efforts out of Stryker Row, a staging area in the remote areas of the southern ash heap. Despite initial successes, the miners were not equipped for dealing with the National Guard and corporate enforcers, especially the Hornwright-funded fleet of strikebreaker robots, customized by Robco Industries, using lethal force to contain and eliminate the workers. The home of millionaires in Appalachia, Bramwell was home to several riots, with some of the miners successfully bringing down an unfinished mega mansion with mining explosives and attacking executives leaving for work from their fortified mansions. One of the historical centers of industry in Appalachia, Beckley was turned into a fortress by the protesters and acted as a base from which to launch raids on corporate facilities on the southern edge of Mount Blair. The National Guard attempted to force the barricades by ramming armored personnel carriers into them and dispersing hallucinogen riot gas, leading to bitter street fighting. The workers were smart enough to board up buildings and establish their base on the rooftops of the town, including an infirmary. Despite bloody fighting elsewhere, the rioting in Charleston was limited, due to the heavy presence of military bots, especially outside the headquarters of Hornwright Industrial. A separate facet of the riots took place at Poseidon Energy Plant WV06, a coal power plant originally built in the 1970s to provide power to the western parts of Appalachia, refitted with ultrasite leased from AMS. The influence of these two companies and their close ties to the federal government resulted in intense controls and oversight. The switchover coincided with an increasingly hostile approach to workers at the plant, culminating in a walkout. The workers wanted a contract that gave them job security and were supported by the National Miners Union. As per company policy, all workers who joined the picket outside the plant were fired on the spot. Since the plant was using ultrasite, the plant security manager had no trouble convincing the executives that this was a national security issue. The National Guard arrived with heavy tanks, APCs, and a load of hallucinogen gas. The plan was to gas the picketing strikers, making them turn on each other, turning a strike into a deadly riot that could be leveraged to further weaken organized labor. What they did not realize was that the gas would turn the peaceful protesters into a violent mob. Once the gas took effect, they rushed through the smoke, attacking the soldiers and tearing off their gas masks, resulting in many fatalities. Located in the northern part of the region, Clarksburg has signs of unrest, including mannequins hanging from nooses holding anti-automation picket signs. An event known as the Clay Riot took place in Harper's Ferry on a Thursday in the early 2070s. A precursor to the automation riots, it prompted a curfew for the town in response to the incidents of violence. After the curfew was lifted, Antonio Childs was murdered in a robbery at the Harper's Ferry train yard. He was a wealthy contractor who took cushy government contracts that let him skim money on the side. People have spread rumors about how he got the money, so this may have been part of the motive for his killing. On Mount Blair, miners seized the Rockhound, a major symbol of automation, for 8 days. The miners held out, striking and demanding a right to work, until the National Guard sent in specially designed fleets of combat robots, strikebreakers, commissioned by Hornwright in the wake of the mine protests, to eliminate the rioters, resembling to some the events of the Battle of Mount Blair over 150 years earlier. The strikebreakers took out the miners and returned control of the Rockhound to Hornwright. Seeking to increase profits, or at least to keep up with the other companies, a supply plant in Pittsburgh began to purchase Protectrons as labor and place them throughout the facility. Despite the reassurances of management, the workers were fearing for their livelihoods. The manager of the plant, Tom McCullen, tried to delay their inevitable terminations. by complaining to management about problems with the equipment, declaring that because of this they could not be ready for the next shipment. Management went to the plant to review the machines, seeing firsthand how they were working fine, outcompeting their best employees by a factor of 5. This was also when the employees began to vandalize the automatrons, 2 of whom were caught by management and promptly fired. 2 new protectrons immediately replaced them on the assembly line, followed by the delayed shipment. The company chose to inform the termination of its employees via a loudspeaker, which announced that all employees had to leave by 1:00 p.m., stating that, due to budget cuts, this plant is shutting down. The employees began to barricade the doors and take up arms. As a senior employee, Tom McCullen was now blamed by the workers as helping replace them. Now, in a panic, he grabbed his pistol and tried to make a break for the door, eventually having to run into a utility closet and lock the door behind him. The workers that cornered McCullen laughed at his pleas for them to vacate the premises, determined to assault him for not being truthful to them about their impending termination. This was when the protectrons arrived. At first, they believed that they could handle a few protectrons, but they were overcome by the machines.